Part 1, The Unwilling Student. The exchange program no one asked for. Lieutenant Marcus Webb adjusted his position on the uncomfortable alien seating, trying not to wince as the crystalline edges dug into his spine. 6 months into the cultural exchange program at Nexus War Academy, and he still couldn't figure out if this was the worst assignment of his military career or just the weirdest. Today's lesson would definitely push it toward the former. Class, today we examine the tactical elimination of Homo sapiens, announced General Krethak, his massive saurian frame casting shadows across the amphitheater. The general's scaled hide gleamed under the harsh lighting, and his yellow eyes swept across the assembled alien cadets with predatory satisfaction. Our subject is conveniently present for demonstration purposes. Marcus felt 36 non-human stares focus on him like targeting lasers. He kept his expression neutral, though inside he was questioning every life choice that had led him to this moment. The Galactic Defense Force had called it an unprecedented opportunity for interspecies cooperation. Right now, it felt more like being a lab rat in a very advanced, very dangerous experiment. Dissecting human weakness. The holographic display flickered to life, showing a detailed anatomical model that looked suspiciously like Marcus himself. The resemblance was unsettling enough that he unconsciously checked to make sure all his limbs were still attached and not floating in midair as educational props. The human spine, General Krethak continued, using a pointer that could probably double as a weapon, contains 33 vertebrae. A precise strike at the C2 vertebra will result in immediate paralysis. He demonstrated with disturbing enthusiasm, the holographic human crumpling in a way that made Marcus's own neck ache in sympathy. A student in the third row, some sort of insectoid creature with mandibles that clicked nervously, raised what might have been a hand. General, what about the humans' reaction time? Surely they would attempt to evade such an attack. Marcus bit back a laugh. Attempt to evade? Half the time he walked into glass doors because he was too busy checking his phone. The idea that humans had some kind of supernatural reflexes was both flattering and completely ridiculous. Excellent question, Cadet Vorthak, the general replied. Human reaction time averages 0.25 seconds for visual stimuli. However, this can be exploited through misdirection and overwhelming sensory input. The display changed to show attack patterns and feints. Additionally, humans suffer from a psychological phenomenon called freeze response when faced with unexpected threats. The art of human hunting. As the lecture continued, Marcus found himself taking notes out of pure academic habit. It was surreal, writing down the best ways to kill members of his own species, but the information was genuinely fascinating from a tactical perspective. Plus, his commanding officer had been very clear about the importance of cultural integration and showing respect for alien educational methods. Now, regarding environmental advantages, General Krethak pulled up star charts showing various planetary conditions. Humans evolved on a single world with very specific atmospheric and gravitational conditions. They require 21% oxygen content and struggle significantly in gravities above 1.5 standard units. A gelatinous student near the front bubbled something in a language that sounded like drowning. The general's translator device rendered it as, "What about their tool dependency? Surely removing their technology would cripple them?" Indeed, Cadet Morpheus. Humans are perhaps the most tool-dependent species in the galaxy. Strip away their weapons, their communication devices, their environmental suits, and they become remarkably vulnerable. The general's teeth, all 47 of them, gleamed in what Marcus had learned was the saurian equivalent of a smile. They lack natural armor, offensive capabilities, enhanced strength, or specialized survival adaptations. Taking notes on your own demise. Marcus dutifully wrote down tool-dependent and lacks natural weapons in his notebook, right next to remember to call mom and laundry day Thursday. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was essentially helping compile a manual for human extinction, but there was something oddly entertaining about the whole situation. The lecture continued with discussions of human sleep patterns, they become completely unconscious for approximately 8 hours daily. Dietary requirements, remarkably narrow compared to most sapient species, and social structures, tendency to form emotional attachments that can be exploited. For homework, General Krethak announced as the session neared its end, "I want each of you to design a theoretical scenario for subduing a human opponent. Consider everything we've discussed today: physical limitations, psychological vulnerabilities, and environmental dependencies." The alien students filed out, chattering excitedly in various languages about their human hunting homework assignments. Marcus remained seated, finishing his notes and wondering if he should feel insulted by how easy they made it sound to eliminate his entire species. The uncomfortable truth. As he finally stood to leave, General Krethak approached him. Up close, the Saurian was even more intimidating, standing nearly 3 meters tall with claws that could probably open cans or arteries with equal ease. "Lieutenant Webb," the general rumbled, "I trust today's lesson was educational?" Marcus met those predatory yellow eyes with what he hoped was professional composure. "Very much so, sir. Though I have to ask, is there a particular reason the Galactic Defense Force is so interested in human combat vulnerabilities?" The general's expression was unreadable, a skill that probably came in handy when you had a face designed by evolution to strike terror into prey species. "Knowledge is power, Lieutenant. Understanding weaknesses helps us protect against them, does it not?" Something in the way he said it made Marcus's survival instincts twitch. But he simply nodded, gathered his things, and headed for the door, already wondering what tomorrow's lesson would reveal about humanity's shortcomings. Behind him, General Krethak watched the human leave with calculating eyes, already planning the next phase of what was turning out to be a very interesting experiment indeed. Part 2, Anatomy of Defeat. The Medical Wing's Dark Purpose. Dr. Nathan Cross had always believed that medicine was about healing, not harm. That belief was being severely tested as he stood in the sterile laboratory of the Nexus Medical Research Center, watching alien students dissect holographic human organs with disturbing enthusiasm. The irony that he was here as part of a medical cooperation initiative wasn't lost on him. "Today we explore the fascinating fragility of human biology," announced Dr. Xylophon, whose crystalline body refracted the laboratory lights into rainbow patterns across the walls. The alien physician's voice resonated with harmonic frequencies that made Nathan's teeth ache. "Dr. Cross has graciously volunteered to serve as our living reference model." Nathan forced a smile and waved at the assembled students. Graciously volunteered was a generous way of describing his assignment, but arguing with Galactic Medical Command seemed like a career-limiting move. Besides, the research exchange was supposed to advance interspecies medical understanding. He just hadn't expected the understanding to focus quite so heavily on human mortality. Weakness in every system. The holographic display materialized a perfect replica of Nathan's cardiovascular system, complete with real-time blood flow indicators. It was like watching his own body betray its secrets to a room full of potential enemies, though he tried to maintain his professional objectivity. "Observe the human circulatory system," Dr. Xylophon continued, manipulating the display with movements that looked more like conducting an orchestra than practicing medicine. Unlike the redundant circulatory networks of Zephyrian physiology or the distributed systems of hive species, humans rely on a single primary pump. A student with what appeared to be gills and tentacles raised an appendage. "Dr. Xylophon, what happens if this primary pump ceases function?" "Excellent question, Cadet Nautilus. Complete system failure occurs within 4 to 6 minutes. No backup systems, no redundancy, no evolutionary safeguards." The crystalline doctor's harmonics took on what Nathan was learning to recognize as excitement. Furthermore, this critical organ is protected only by a thin cage of calcium carbonate structures. Nathan unconsciously put his hand over his chest. Calcium carbonate structures? They made his ribs sound like seashells. He made a mental note to start referring to alien bones with equally dismissive terminology, assuming he survived long enough to get the chance. The fragile human machine. "Now, let us examine the respiratory system," Dr. Xylophon announced, and the display shifted to show Nathan's lungs in disturbingly vivid detail. Humans require constant atmospheric exchange through these primitive gas-filled sacs. Interruption of this process for more than 3 minutes results in irreversible damage. A rocky-looking student that resembled a walking boulder asked, "What about their backup respiratory systems?" "They have none," the doctor replied with what sounded like amusement. Humans breathe through a single pathway that serves double duty for both respiration and nutrition intake. It's a remarkable design flaw that creates multiple vulnerability points. Nathan tried not to think about how every breath he took was apparently evidence of humanity's evolutionary incompetence. The students were taking notes with the dedication of scholars studying for final exams, which, given the subject matter, was probably exactly what they were doing. Blood and vulnerability. The lesson continued with an exploration of human blood composition that made Nathan feel like he was watching a cooking show for vampires. Dr. Xylophon explained how human blood clotting was admirably inefficient compared to crystalline self-repair matrices, and how blood loss of just 30% could incapacitate a human completely. The human nervous system, the doctor continued, pulling up a new display that lit up Nathan's spine like a Christmas tree, is perhaps their greatest weakness. Unlike distributed consciousness species, humans store all cognitive function in a single, poorly protected organ. A student that looked like an oversized praying mantis clicked its mandibles thoughtfully. "Dr. Xylophon, are there any human biological systems that could be considered robust?" The pause that followed was so long that Nathan began to worry about his species' reputation. Finally, Dr. Xylophon's harmonics shifted to what might have been grudging respect. "Their immune system shows remarkable adaptability," the doctor admitted. "And their pain tolerance, while inferior to most species, is coupled with an unusual psychological trait. They often continue functioning despite significant physical damage." The temperature problem. Environmental vulnerabilities present additional opportunities, Dr. Xylophon continued, displaying thermal imaging of human physiology. Humans maintain their biological functions within an extremely narrow temperature range. Deviation of just 10 degrees in either direction begins to impair performance. Nathan thought about every time he'd complained about the office air conditioning and realized he was apparently a walking thermal emergency waiting to happen. Their skin provides minimal protection against environmental hazards, the doctor explained, zooming in on cross-sections that made Nathan acutely aware of how thin and exposed human skin really was. No natural armor, no toxin resistance, no radiation shielding. They require artificial protection for survival in most galactic environments. A student with what appeared to be natural body armor raised a claw. "Dr. Xylophon, given all these vulnerabilities, how did humans achieve spaceflight?" The crystalline doctor's harmonics shifted to something that sounded almost puzzled. "That, Cadet Armadix, is an excellent question. By all biological measures, humans should have remained confined to their homeworld. Their success in expanding beyond Earth's atmosphere despite their physical limitations is anomalous." The healing paradox. As the class moved into discussions of human healing rates and recovery capabilities, Nathan found himself taking notes almost automatically. The clinical detachment was easier than thinking too hard about the implications of what was being taught. "Human tissue regeneration is remarkably slow," Dr. Xylophon explained. "A minor laceration that would heal in hours for a Zephyrian requires days for human tissue. Major injuries can take weeks or months to fully repair." However, the doctor continued, and Nathan noticed the shift in tone, humans demonstrate an unusual capacity to adapt their behavior to compensate for physical limitations. They also show remarkable psychological resilience in maintaining function despite ongoing physiological stress. The lesson concluded with homework assignments that made Nathan's stomach turn, designing theoretical biological weapons specifically targeted at human physiology. As the students filed out, chattering excitedly about toxins and pathogens, Nathan remained behind to review his notes. The doctor's dilemma. Dr. Xylophon approached as Nathan packed up his materials. Up close, the crystalline being structure was even more fascinating and intimidating, light refracting through faceted surfaces in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Dr. Cross, the harmonics were softer now, almost conversational. I hope today's session was illuminating. Nathan met what he thought might be the alien's eyes, though with a crystalline being it was hard to tell. It was certainly educational, Dr. Xylophon. Though I have to ask, is this research being conducted for defensive or offensive purposes? The alien doctor's form seemed to dim slightly, the light patterns shifting to deeper, more complex frequencies. In medicine, Dr. Cross, the line between healing and harming is often thinner than we care to admit. Understanding vulnerability is the first step toward protection, is it not? Something in those harmonics made Nathan think of his own medical oath, about first doing no harm. He nodded slowly and headed for the exit, wondering if he was helping save human lives or providing the blueprint for their destruction. Behind him, Dr. Xylophon watched the human leave, the crystal structure pulsing with frequencies that no human ear could detect, frequencies that sounded almost like concern. Part 3, The Psychology of Fear. Inside the mind's battlefield. Agent Tyler Brooks had infiltrated terrorist cells, survived interrogation by hostile governments, and once spent 3 weeks undercover in a Martian mining colony. None of that had prepared him for sitting in a classroom while aliens dissected his species' psychological weaknesses with surgical precision. The Psychological Warfare Department of Nexus Academy felt more like a therapy session designed by sadists. The human mind, announced Counselor Medes, her ethereal form shifting between translucent and solid as her telepathic abilities fluctuated, is perhaps their most exploitable weakness. Her voice seemed to come from inside Tyler's head rather than his ears, a sensation that never stopped being deeply unsettling. Tyler maintained his poker face, though keeping secrets from a telepathic professor was like trying to hide underwater while breathing loudly. The 30-some alien students in the amphitheater leaned forward with the enthusiasm of children watching a magic show, except the magic involved breaking human minds. The architecture of human fear. Unlike species with collective consciousness or emotional dampening capabilities, Counselor Medes continued, her form solidifying as she focused on the lesson, humans experience fear as an overwhelming individual response that can completely override rational thinking. The holographic display materialized showing neural pathways lighting up like a city during a power surge. Tyler recognized it as a human brain under stress, probably his own, given how specifically accurate the scan appeared to be. Observe the amygdala activation, Medes gestured to a region that was practically glowing red. When triggered, this primitive structure floods the human system with stress hormones, creating what they call fight, flight, or freeze responses. Each can be manipulated for tactical advantage. A student with compound eyes and antenna raised what might have been a hand. Counselor Medes, how do we trigger these fear responses effectively? Tyler felt his jaw tighten. Academic curiosity was one thing, but this was getting uncomfortably practical. Excellent question, Cadet Buswick. Humans fear the unknown above all else. Isolation from their social groups, uncertainty about outcomes, and threats to their physical integrity create cascading psychological collapse. The counselor's form flickered with what Tyler was learning to recognize as telepathic amusement. They also have an irrational fear of the dark, despite having evolved beyond the need for constant vigilance. Social weakness and isolation. The lesson shifted to human social psychology, and Tyler found himself taking notes despite the subject matter hitting uncomfortably close to home. His training had covered psychological warfare, but seeing it from the other side was enlightening in ways he wished it wasn't. Humans are fundamentally social creatures, Medes explained, displaying neural scans showing social bonding patterns. Remove them from their support networks, and their psychological stability deteriorates rapidly. Solitary confinement can break a human mind in weeks. Tyler thought about his last deep cover assignment, months without real human contact, and realized why it had been so much harder than he'd expected. Apparently, his psychological training had been fighting millions of years of evolution. Furthermore, the counselor continued, humans form emotional attachments that can be weaponized. Threaten their offspring, their mates, or even their companion animals, and they will make tactically unsound decisions driven by emotion rather than logic. A student that resembled a walking tree asked, "What about their leadership structures? Surely disrupting command hierarchies would create confusion?" Indeed, Cadet Oakley. Human organizations rely heavily on individual leadership rather than distributed decision-making. Remove key figures, and entire command structures can collapse into chaos. The display showed organizational charts dissolving as key nodes were eliminated. They also suffer from something called hero syndrome. Individual humans will attempt to solve problems beyond their capabilities rather than retreat or seek assistance. The weight of existence. The most disturbing part of the lecture came when Counselor Medes began discussing human existential anxieties. Her telepathic abilities allowed her to peer into the deepest fears that most humans barely acknowledge to themselves. Humans are unique among sapient species in their acute awareness of their own mortality, she explained, her form taking on darker, more solid tones. This knowledge creates persistent background anxiety that affects all their decision-making processes. They fear death, but they also fear meaninglessness, abandonment, and failure. Tyler felt an uncomfortable chill as he realized the counselor was probably reading these exact fears from his own mind as she spoke. The telepathic ethics protocol supposedly prevented deep scanning without consent, but surface thoughts were apparently fair game. Their religion and philosophy systems, Medes continued, are primarily coping mechanisms for these existential fears. Disrupt their belief systems, and you can trigger psychological crisis without any physical threat. Stress responses and breaking points. The class moved into practical applications that made Tyler's training scenarios look like children's games. Counselor Medes explained how sleep deprivation, sensory overload, and cognitive dissonance could be combined to break human psychological resistance. The human stress response system, she demonstrated with brain scans showing cortisol flooding neural pathways, was designed for short-term physical threats. Extended psychological pressure creates cumulative damage that compounds over time. A student with what appeared to be natural camouflage abilities asked, "Counselor, what about human adaptability? Surely they develop resistance to these techniques?" The counselor's form flickered with something that might have been respect. Humans do show remarkable psychological resilience in some circumstances. They can adapt to extreme conditions and maintain function under pressures that would incapacitate other species. However, this resilience often comes at the cost of long-term psychological damage. Tyler found himself writing down "resilience with damage" and wondering if that described his entire career. The memory problem. Human memory systems present unique vulnerabilities, Medes explained, displaying neural networks that looked like tangled Christmas lights. Unlike species with perfect recall or distributed memory storage, humans remember selectively and inaccurately. Their memories can be altered, implanted, or suppressed with relative ease. The implications of that statement hit Tyler like a cold shower. How much of what he remembered was real? How many of his own memories had been altered during his various psychological evaluations and debriefings? Additionally, the counselor continued, apparently oblivious to Tyler's existential crisis, humans suffer from what they call nostalgia, an emotional attachment to past experiences that can be exploited. They also project future scenarios based on past patterns, making their behavior somewhat predictable. The assignment from hell. As the class concluded, Counselor Medes announced the homework assignment that made Tyler consider requesting a transfer to a nice, safe war zone somewhere. For next session, I want each of you to design a psychological profile for breaking a human subject. Consider individual personality types, cultural backgrounds, and personal history. Remember, the goal is complete psychological surrender without physical harm. The alien students filed out with the enthusiasm of art students heading to a gallery opening, chattering about trauma responses and conditioning techniques. Tyler remained seated, staring at his notes and wondering if he should burn them or frame them. The telepathic truth. Counselor Medes approached as Tyler gathered his materials. Her form had solidified into something almost reassuringly humanoid, though the translucent quality remained. Agent Brooks, her mental voice was softer now, almost gentle. I sense your discomfort with today's material. Tyler looked up at what he hoped were her eyes. With respect, Counselor, it's not every day you attend a masterclass on breaking your own species' minds. Her form flickered with what felt like telepathic amusement mixed with something deeper. Perhaps, Agent Brooks, the purpose of understanding weakness is not always exploitation. Sometimes knowledge is the first step toward strength. The words echoed in Tyler's mind as he left the classroom, wondering if he was learning how to protect humanity or providing the tools for its psychological destruction. Behind him, Counselor Medes watched his mental patterns with ancient, knowing attention, seeing fears and hopes that Tyler himself barely understood. Part 4: Environmental Exploitation. The Simulation Chamber of Doom. Captain Jerome Mitchell had survived the Amazon rainforest, the Sahara Desert, 3 different Arctic expeditions, and a particularly unpleasant weekend in Detroit. None of that had prepared him for standing in the environmental combat simulation chamber while an aquatic alien explained the 1,000 different ways Earth's environment could kill him. The chamber could replicate any planetary condition in the galaxy, and today's lesson plan read like a greatest hits collection of human suffering. Welcome to Environmental Warfare 401, announced Specialist Gorvok, his massive form undulating in the specialized atmospheric tank that allowed him to teach outside his native deep ocean environment. Today we explore how planetary conditions can be weaponized against human physiology. Jerome adjusted his environmental suit and checked his breathing apparatus. The irony that he needed life support equipment just to attend a class about human environmental weaknesses wasn't lost on him. Around the chamber, 40-some alien students observed from their own environmental protection systems, a rainbow coalition of species that could probably survive in conditions that would reduce Jerome to constituent atoms. The gravity of the situation. First, let us examine gravitational vulnerabilities, Specialist Gorvok announced, and Jerome felt the chamber's artificial gravity begin to fluctuate. Humans evolved in a specific gravitational environment. Observe what happens when we exceed their comfort parameters. The gravity increased gradually, and Jerome felt his knees begin to protest. At 1.5 Earth gravity, walking became difficult. At 2 g, he was struggling to remain upright. At 2.5 g, he was forced to sit down heavily, feeling like he weighed 400 pounds. Note how quickly the human's mobility is compromised, Gorvok observed to his students, who were watching Jerome's distress with academic fascination. At 3 times Earth gravity, human bone density becomes insufficient to support their own body weight. Cardiac function becomes severely impaired as the heart struggles to pump blood against increased pressure. A student resembling a crystalline spider asked, Specialist Gorvok, what about reduced gravity environments? Excellent question, Cadet Prism. The gravity suddenly dropped, and Jerome found himself floating helplessly as his body tried to adapt to near-zero conditions. While less immediately dangerous, reduced gravity causes rapid bone density loss, muscle atrophy, and disorientation. Humans become essentially helpless in 3-dimensional combat environments. Jerome grabbed onto a handheld as he drifted past, trying to maintain some dignity while demonstrating humanity's gravitational incompetence to a room full of aliens who probably thought humans were the galaxy's most poorly designed sapient species. Atmospheric inadequacy. The gravity returned to normal, and Jerome gratefully felt his feet touch the floor again. His relief was short-lived as Specialist Gorvok announced the next phase of the demonstration. Now we examine atmospheric vulnerabilities, the aquatic instructor announced, and Jerome felt the air mixture in his suit begin to change. Humans require a very specific atmospheric composition. Observe their rapid deterioration when oxygen levels are reduced. Jerome's oxygen concentration dropped from 21% to 15%, and he immediately felt his thinking become fuzzy. His movements slowed, and he found himself breathing harder despite the reduced physical demands. At 10% oxygen, Gorvok explained, as Jerome's world began to swim, humans lose consciousness. At 6%, permanent brain damage occurs within minutes. They also cannot survive in atmospheres with too much oxygen. Concentrations above 50% become toxic over time. A student that looked like a walking gas cloud bubbled a question. What about atmospheric pressure, specialist? Another critical vulnerability, Cadet Nimbus. The chamber's pressure began to change, and Jerome felt his ears pop painfully. Reduce atmospheric pressure below 0.5 Earth standard, and human blood begins to boil. Increase it beyond 3 atmospheres, and nitrogen narcosis impairs cognitive function. Jerome made a mental note to never again complain about airline cabin pressure while trying not to let his ears bleed from the demonstration. Temperature extremes and human fragility. The atmospheric conditions returned to normal, and Jerome had a moment to catch his breath before Specialist Gorvok announced the next torture session, educational demonstration. Temperature regulation presents numerous tactical opportunities, the instructor announced, and Jerome felt the chamber's climate control system engage with ominous humming sounds. Humans maintain core body temperature within an extremely narrow range. The temperature began to rise, and Jerome's environmental suit's cooling system kicked in with audible strain. At 40 degrees Celsius core temperature, human cognitive function deteriorates rapidly. At 42 degrees, cellular damage begins. Death occurs at 44 degrees. Jerome felt sweat beading inside his suit despite the cooling systems. Around him, alien students who probably considered molten lava a refreshing bath took notes about human thermal incompetence. Conversely, Gorvok continued, and the temperature plummeted. Humans begin losing dexterity at 15 degrees Celsius. Core temperature drops of just 2 degrees cause severe impairment. At 30 degrees core temperature, humans lose consciousness. The cold was biting through Jerome's suit now, and he found his teeth chattering as he tried to maintain professional composure while serving as a living example of humanity's thermal inadequacy. Radiation and chemical vulnerabilities. As if the temperature extremes weren't enough, Specialist Gorvok moved on to radiation exposure simulation. Jerome's suit's radiation detectors began clicking ominously as the chamber filled with harmless but detectable radiation signatures. Human cellular structure, Gorvok explained, provides minimal protection against radiation exposure. Doses that would be harmless to crystalline or energy species cause immediate cellular damage in humans. A student with what appeared to be natural radiation shielding asked, "What about chemical warfare, specialist?" Humans are remarkably vulnerable to chemical attacks, Gorvok replied, and Jerome noticed several nozzles extending from the chamber walls. Their respiratory system draws atmospheric chemicals directly into their bloodstream. Many compounds that are harmless to other species are lethal to humans in minimal concentrations. Jerome's environmental suit sealed itself automatically as trace amounts of various chemical signatures were introduced to the chamber. His life support systems worked overtime to filter out compounds that could apparently kill him in parts per million concentrations. The water problem. Perhaps most critically, Specialist Gorvok continued with what sounded like professional satisfaction: humans have an extreme dependency on water availability. They can survive only 3 to 5 days without water intake, and their performance deteriorates rapidly as dehydration progresses. Jerome thought about every survival situation he'd ever faced and realized that water had indeed been the critical limiting factor in almost every case. He'd never quite appreciated how that made humans uniquely vulnerable compared to species that could derive moisture from atmospheric humidity or had different metabolic requirements. Additionally, the aquatic instructor continued, humans cannot process most water sources without technological purification. Naturally occurring water on most planets contains compounds that are toxic to human physiology. A student resembling a mobile coral reef asked, "Specialist, are there any environmental conditions where humans show superior performance?" The pause that followed was long enough that Jerome began to worry about his species' reputation. Finally, Gorvok's response carried what might have been grudging respect. Humans demonstrate remarkable adaptability within their narrow environmental parameters. They can function in a wider range of conditions than their physiology suggests should be possible. They also show unusual persistence in hostile environments, often continuing to operate despite conditions that should incapacitate them. The lessons end. As the environmental simulation wound down and conditions returned to human comfortable norms, Jerome felt like he'd just completed the galaxy's most comprehensive course in personal inadequacy. The alien students filed out, discussing homework assignments that involved designing environmental weapons specifically tailored to human vulnerabilities. Specialist Gorvok approached Jerome's position, his massive form moving gracefully through his aquatic medium. "Captain Mitchell, I trust today's demonstration was educational?" Jerome removed his helmet and met what he thought were the alien's eyes, though with an aquatic species it was hard to tell. "It certainly was, Specialist. Though I have to ask, is there a particular reason the Academy is so focused on human environmental vulnerabilities?" The aquatic being's response was delivered through hydrophonic resonance that Jerome's translator rendered with concerning ambiguity. "Understanding limitations helps us plan for contingencies, Captain. The question is whether we plan to overcome them, or exploit them." Jerome left the chamber with that thought echoing in his mind, wondering if he was helping humanity prepare for survival in a hostile galaxy, or providing the blueprint for its environmental destruction. Behind him, Specialist Gorvok watched through the aquatic barrier, his ancient eyes holding secrets that no human was meant to understand.